You're sitting in your home right now. Safe. The doors are locked. The temperature is controlled. There's food in your kitchen. And yet, somewhere deep in your chest, there's a tightness you can't explain. A feeling that something is wrong. That you need to check the locks again. That you need to save more money even though you have enough. That you can't relax even when there's nothing to fear. That feeling isn't anxiety disorder. It isn't overthinking. It's not a character flaw. It's your ancestors. And they're still alive inside you. What I'm about to reveal to you over the next 40 minutes is knowledge that anthropologists discovered after examining behavioral patterns across 7 continents, spanning 150,000 years of human survival. This is part 1 of a 9-part series that will finally answer a question you've probably asked yourself dozens of times: why do I react this way when there's no logical reason to? The answer is written in your nervous system. Encoded by generations who faced threats you'll never see but whose responses you carry every single day. Before we begin, I need you to understand something critical. This is not astrology. This is not personality typing. This is evolutionary inheritance, backed by evolutionary evidence that shows how environment, climate, predation patterns, and resource scarcity physically altered the human stress response over thousands of generations. And what most textbooks no longer teach is this: those alterations never went away. Your body is still preparing for threats that vanished centuries ago. Your mind is still running protocols designed for a world that no longer exists. And modern society punishes you for it. Calls it anxiety. Calls it paranoia. Calls it dysfunction. But what if it's actually the most functional thing about you? What if the reason you can't turn it off is because turning it off would have meant death for every single person whose DNA led to you? Let me explain something that will change how you see yourself. Right now, as you're hearing this, your amygdala is scanning for threats. It does this approximately 11 times per second, even when you're not consciously thinking about danger. This scanning pattern was documented in neurological studies across 43 countries, and the results revealed something anthropologists are still trying to fully understand. The scanning patterns differ based on ancestry. Not race. Not ethnicity. Ancestry. The specific environments your genetic line survived in for generation after generation, century after century, until the way they survived became the way you think. Over the next 40 minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly 9 survival instincts that are still controlling your behavior today. 9 patterns that were explained, revealed, and finally answered through decades of research that examined everything from migration patterns to starvation responses to predator avoidance across every inhabited continent on Earth. Each instinct has a name. Each instinct has an origin. Each instinct has a modern expression that you probably experience but never understood. And each instinct carries a warning. Because what saved your ancestors might be destroying you. Not because the instinct is broken, but because the world it was designed for disappeared while the instinct remained. Let's begin with the first one. The one that affects more people than any other. The one that explains why you can't relax even when you should be able to. The first survival instinct is called hyper-vigilance encoding, and it originates from ancestral populations who lived in open grassland environments between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago, primarily across the African savanna, the Eurasian steppe, and the central plains of what is now North America. Here's what anthropologists discovered. In open environments with limited tree cover and predictable seasonal patterns, early human groups faced one overwhelming survival pressure that dominated every waking moment: visibility. They could be seen from a distance of up to 3 kilometers by predators who hunted in coordinated packs. Large cats. Hyenas. Early canids who learned to follow human migration routes. These predators had visual acuity approximately 8 times sharper than modern humans, which meant that in flat, open terrain, the predators always saw you first. Always. Evolutionary evidence shows that groups who survived these environments developed a specific neurological response that fired in the absence of threat. Not in response to danger. In the absence of it. When everything seemed calm, when the horizon was empty, when there were no visible signs of predators for hours at a time, the survivors were the ones whose nervous systems refused to relax. The ones who kept scanning. Kept watching. Kept assuming that calm was temporary. Because it was. Predator attacks in open environments followed a documented pattern. Long periods of apparent safety, followed by sudden coordinated ambush from downwind directions where scent wouldn't carry. The average warning time between first visual contact and attack was between 8 and 14 seconds. 8 seconds. The groups who survived were not the ones who reacted to danger. By the time you saw the danger, it was already too late. The survivors were the ones who never believed they were safe in the first place. This created what researchers now call a baseline vigilance override. A permanent state of low-level alertness that doesn't turn off even when threats disappear. And here's what makes this instinct so powerful: it wasn't just behavioral. It was genetic. Studies of modern descendants whose genetic markers trace back to open grassland environments show consistently elevated cortisol baseline levels compared to descendants of forest-dwelling populations. Not during stress. During rest. Their bodies produce between 12 and 18% more stress hormone even when they're doing nothing. Even when they're safe. Even when they should be calm. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You check the locks multiple times before bed. You glance at your phone constantly even when you're not expecting anything. You have trouble falling asleep because your mind keeps running through scenarios that haven't happened. You feel uncomfortable in open spaces like parking lots or parks where you can't see what's behind you. You prefer seats in restaurants where you can see the door. None of this is paranoia. This is hypervigilance encoding. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Scan for threats in environments where threats moved faster than reaction time allowed. But here's the warning. Modern society interprets this behavior as anxiety disorder. As something broken that needs to be fixed. Therapists will try to teach you relaxation techniques. Medications will try to lower your baseline cortisol. Everyone will tell you to calm down. But what if calming down is the dangerous thing? What if your ancestors encoded this response precisely because the calm ones died? This is the question that makes people uncomfortable. Because it suggests that maybe, just maybe, the way you are isn't a malfunction. Maybe it's the most functional response to a world that's only recently become safe. A world that might not stay that way. And your body knows it. Let me take you to the second instinct now. One that explains behavior that modern culture actively shames people for. One that reveals why some people can never have enough even when they have more than they need. The second survival instinct is called scarcity hoarding response, and it originates from ancestral populations who survived in environments with extreme seasonal variation, particularly in northern temperate zones between 55,000 and 8,000 years ago. Anthropologists documented this across populations in what is now Scandinavia, northern Russia, northern China, Korea, Japan, and the northern regions of the British Isles. These were environments where winter lasted between 5 and 8 months, where temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, where plant food disappeared entirely for more than half the year. Here's the specific threat these populations faced. Starvation wasn't a risk. It was a calendar event. Every single winter, without exception, food scarcity reached life-threatening levels. Stored food from autumn determined survival. Groups that consumed their resources evenly across the winter didn't make it to spring. The survivors were the ones who hoarded beyond what seemed rational. Who stored more than they thought they'd need. Who hid resources even from their own group members. Because here's what evolutionary evidence revealed. During severe winters, resource sharing decreased by as much as 73% within even close-knit groups. When people were starving, kinship bonds weakened. Alliances dissolved. Theft became common. The survivors weren't the generous ones. They were the ones who kept secret storage locations that nobody else knew about. Who maintained hidden caches of dried meat, preserved fish, and rendered fat that could sustain them when group resources ran out. Research into burial sites from these regions, dating back 32,000 years, shows evidence of concealed storage pits dug beneath sleeping areas, separate from communal food stores. These weren't for the group. They were for the individual family line. This created a psychological pattern that researchers call anticipatory resource guarding. The instinct to acquire and hide resources not based on current need, but based on the certainty of future scarcity. And here's what makes this instinct so difficult for modern people to understand. The scarcity never had to happen for the instinct to fire. The mere approach of the season was enough. Even in years with adequate food, even when storage was sufficient, the drive to hoard intensified as autumn progressed. Because for 50,000 years, autumn meant time was running out. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You have trouble throwing things away even when you don't need them. You keep buying extra supplies even when your storage is full. You have multiple backup plans for situations that probably won't happen. You feel physical discomfort when you see your bank account dropping even if you're nowhere near financial danger. You hide purchases from your partner not because you're ashamed but because something in you says keep this secret, keep this separate, keep this safe. You might have drawers full of batteries you'll never use. Cabinets packed with canned food you'll never eat. Closets full of clothes you'll never wear. And everyone tells you it's irrational. Everyone tells you to let go. But here's the warning. What if letting go is the irrational thing? What if your instinct understands something modern comfort has made people forget? That stability is temporary. That abundance doesn't last. That winter always comes. And when it does, the people who survive aren't the ones who trusted that everything would be fine. They're the ones who prepared when everyone else said they were overreacting. Your ancestors weren't hoarders. They were survivors. And the only reason you exist is because they refused to believe the good times would last. Now let me show you the third instinct. The one that explains why some people come alive after dark while others shut down completely. The third survival instinct is called nocturnal activation pattern, and it originates from ancestral populations who lived in densely forested equatorial and subtropical regions between 80,000 and 15,000 years ago, particularly in what is now Central Africa, Southeast Asia, the Amazon basin, and the Congo. These were environments where the forest canopy was so thick that daytime visibility dropped to less than 15 meters in any direction. Where the floor was permanently shadowed. Where sound was the primary sense for detecting both prey and predators. Here's the specific threat these populations faced. Daytime hunting was nearly impossible because visual tracking failed in dense undergrowth. Large game couldn't be seen until it was within striking distance, which meant the hunter was also within striking distance of anything hunting them. But night changed everything. Anthropologists discovered that in dense forests, darkness actually increased human survival advantage over most predators. Not because humans could see better, but because human hearing adapted to process overlapping soundscapes in ways that forest predators didn't develop. Humans who hunted at night could hear prey movement patterns without being seen. Could communicate through low-frequency vocalizations that traveled further in humid night air. Could move through darkness using spatial memory and tactile ground sensing that didn't require vision. But here's the critical part. Night hunting required a complete reversal of circadian rhythm. Groups that tried to maintain daytime waking patterns and simply extend into darkness didn't develop the necessary sensory adaptations. The survivors were the groups who genetically shifted their neurological peak activity to coincide with darkness. Who became more alert, more focused, more cognitively sharp after sunset than before it. Research into modern descendants with genetic markers from these regions shows something remarkable. Their melatonin production patterns are offset by approximately 2 to 4 hours compared to populations from open or temperate environments. They don't become drowsy when darkness falls. They become activated. Neurological scans show increased prefrontal cortex activity and heightened auditory processing during nocturnal hours in these populations, even when they're living in modern urban environments with artificial light. This is nocturnal activation pattern. Not insomnia. Not a sleep disorder. An inherited reversal of what modern society considers normal waking hours. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You feel foggy and unfocused during morning hours no matter how much sleep you get. You come alive after 9 or 10 at night. Your best thinking happens after midnight. You prefer working night shifts or late hours. You feel uncomfortable going to bed early even when you're tired. You do your best creative work in darkness. And modern society punishes you for this. Jobs start at 8 or 9 in the morning. Schools demand early attendance. Everyone tells you to fix your sleep schedule. Everyone acts like you're broken. But here's the warning. You're not broken. You're adapted. Your ancestors survived because they operated when everyone else was vulnerable. When predators were hunting. When prey was exposed. When other groups were asleep. Forcing yourself into daytime activation doesn't fix you. It suppresses an advantage your genetic line spent tens of thousands of years developing. And here's what nobody talks about. In a crisis, when the power goes out, when normal patterns collapse, when night becomes dangerous again, the people with nocturnal activation pattern are the ones who don't panic. Because darkness isn't a threat to them. It's when they're most capable. Let me take you deeper now. To the fourth instinct. The one that explains why some people always sense conflict before it arrives. The fourth survival instinct is called threat anticipation sensitivity, and it originates from ancestral populations who survived in regions with high intertribal conflict and resource competition, particularly across the Middle East, the Mediterranean coastline, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent between 40,000 and 5,000 years ago. These were environments where resources were abundant enough to support large populations, but localized enough to create constant territorial disputes. Freshwater sources. Fertile valleys. Coastal fishing zones. Grazing lands. Here's the specific threat these populations faced. Violence wasn't random. It was predictable. It followed patterns. Anthropologists discovered through archaeological evidence that warfare in these regions operated on cyclical patterns determined by resource availability. Attacks increased during drought years, harvest seasons, and migration periods. Peace wasn't stable. It was a temporary pause between conflicts that everyone knew would resume. The populations who survived weren't the ones who hoped for peace. They were the ones who prepared for war even during peaceful periods. But preparation required something more sophisticated than weapons or walls. It required the ability to detect subtle social signals that indicated rising aggression before violence actually erupted. Evolutionary evidence shows that groups who survived developed heightened sensitivity to microexpressions, tonal shifts, postural changes, and gaze patterns that preceded hostile action. They could read intent before intent became action. Research into modern descendants with genetic markers from high-conflict regions shows increased activity in the superior temporal sulcus, the region of the brain responsible for interpreting social cues and predicting behavior. These individuals process facial expressions approximately 130 milliseconds faster than populations from low-conflict ancestral regions. 130 milliseconds doesn't sound significant. But in a social interaction that's escalating toward violence, that's the difference between seeing it coming and being caught off guard. This created what researchers call pre-conflict behavioral scanning. The constant, automatic assessment of every person in proximity for signs of impending aggression. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You can sense when someone is angry before they show it. You know when a conversation is about to turn hostile even when everyone else is still smiling. You pick up on tension in rooms that others describe as fine. You avoid certain people not because they've done anything, but because something feels wrong about them. You're often told you're too sensitive. That you read too much into things. That you're paranoid. But here's what's actually happening. You're detecting real signals that other people aren't processing. Signals that your ancestors needed to detect to stay alive. Because in environments where violence was common, the people who waited for obvious aggression before reacting were the ones who didn't survive. The survivors were the ones who left the room before the fight started. Who avoided the person who seemed fine but wasn't. Who trusted the feeling in their gut that said get out now. But here's the warning. Modern society calls this social anxiety. It medicates it. It teaches you to ignore your instincts and give people the benefit of the doubt. And maybe that works in a peaceful world. But your body doesn't believe the world is peaceful. Because for 40,000 years, it wasn't. And the moment peace collapses, the people with threat anticipation sensitivity are the ones who survive. Because they saw it coming. Now let me show you the fifth instinct. The one that explains why some people can never settle. Why they always feel like they need to leave. The fifth survival instinct is called migration readiness encoding, and it originates from ancestral populations who survived in environments with catastrophic and unpredictable environmental collapse, particularly in regions affected by volcanic activity, seismic instability, coastal flooding, and glacial advance between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago. This includes populations along the Pacific Ring of Fire, the East African Rift Valley, coastal regions affected by post-glacial sea level rise, and areas of northern Europe impacted by rapid glacial movement. Here's the specific threat these populations faced. Home was temporary. Without warning, volcanoes would erupt and render entire regions uninhabitable for generations. Earthquakes would destroy settlements. Floods would consume coastlines. Glaciers would advance and force populations hundreds of kilometers south in less than a decade. Anthropologists discovered through geological and archaeological correlation that populations in these regions experienced environmental displacement events approximately every 7 to 12 generations. That's frequent enough that migration wasn't an occasional crisis. It was a recurring life pattern that entire cultures structured themselves around. The populations who survived weren't the ones who built permanent settlements and invested in fixed infrastructure. They were the ones who maintained migration-ready lifestyles. Who kept possessions minimal. Who developed skills that translated across environments. Who formed loose community bonds that could dissolve and reform without trauma. Evolutionary evidence shows that these populations developed what researchers call low attachment adaptation. Not because they didn't care about people or places, but because attachment to any specific location was a survival liability. Genetic studies of modern descendants show interesting neurological differences. They have reduced amygdala response to separation from familiar environments compared to populations from stable ancestral regions. They experience less stress when relocating. They adapt to new places faster. They form functional relationships more quickly. But here's the critical detail. This isn't about being social or friendly. This is about having a nervous system that doesn't interpret change as threat. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You get restless living in the same place for more than a few years. You feel trapped by long-term commitments even when they're beneficial. You keep your possessions minimal not because you're a minimalist but because something in you says stay ready to move. You form friendships easily but don't maintain them long-term. You prefer jobs with flexibility over jobs with stability. And modern society tells you to settle down. To commit. To put down roots. Everyone treats mobility like immaturity. Like you're running from something. But here's the warning. You're not running from something. You're running toward survival. Your ancestors encoded this pattern because the ones who stayed died when the environment turned. The ones who hesitated, who convinced themselves things would be fine, who invested too deeply in one place, were the ones who couldn't leave when they needed to. And here's what makes this instinct especially difficult to understand. The disaster doesn't have to be real. The instinct fires based on signals that might indicate future instability. Economic shifts. Political tension. Climate pattern changes. Housing market fluctuations. Modern people call this overreaction. But your body calls it preparation. Because when the environment does collapse, when the job market crashes, when the region becomes unlivable, the people who survive are the ones who were already planning their exit. Who didn't sink everything into staying. Now let me take you to the sixth instinct. This one is harder to talk about because modern culture doesn't want to acknowledge it exists. The sixth survival instinct is called silence under threat protocol, and it originates from ancestral populations who survived under conditions of social persecution, conquest, enslavement, and systematic violence, documented across multiple continents and time periods spanning the last 10,000 years. This includes populations who survived under occupation, groups who were displaced by expanding empires, communities who endured generations of targeted violence, and lineages who survived by hiding identity, language, religion, or ancestry. Here's the specific threat these populations faced. Visibility meant death. Anthropologists discovered through historical documentation, oral histories, and archaeological evidence that in contexts of persecution, the most dangerous behavior was resistance. Not because resistance was wrong, but because it was fatal. The populations who survived weren't the ones who fought back. They were the ones who went silent. Who hid? Who became invisible? Who learned to suppress external markers of identity and belief while maintaining internal continuity across generations. This created a survival strategy that researchers call adaptive concealment. The ability to function within a hostile dominant culture while protecting core identity from detection. But here's what makes this instinct so psychologically complex. It required the development of a split consciousness. An external presentation that conformed to expectations, and an internal reality that remained hidden. Genetic and epigenetic research shows that descendants of populations who survived extended periods of persecution display specific stress response patterns. When confronted with authority or dominant group members, their cortisol and adrenaline responses spike, but their external behavior becomes more controlled, more compliant, more subdued. It's not submission. It's camouflage. Brain imaging studies show increased activity in regions associated with suppression of spontaneous response when these individuals are in situations that echo ancestral threat patterns. They're not being passive. They're being strategic. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You go quiet when conflict starts instead of arguing back. You agree externally even when you disagree internally. You smile and nod in situations where you feel threatened. You hide your real opinions around authority figures. You have a public self and a private self that are fundamentally different. And modern culture tells you to speak up. To be authentic. To stand your ground. Everyone acts like silence is weakness. But here's the warning. Silence isn't weakness. For your ancestors, silence was survival. Speaking up meant being identified. Being identified meant being targeted. Being targeted meant death. You carry that strategy in your nervous system. And here's the uncomfortable truth, in situations where power is genuinely unequal, where consequences are real, where speaking up actually does put you at risk, silence is still the functional response. Modern people want to believe we live in a world where honesty is safe. Where standing up for yourself is respected. Where truth is protected. Your body doesn't believe that. Because for 10,000 years, it wasn't true. And the instinct that kept your lineage alive was the instinct to stay quiet, stay hidden, stay unnoticed until the danger passed. Let me take you to the seventh instinct now. This one explains behavior that people judge harshly but don't understand at all. The seventh survival instinct is called authority-threat differentiation, and it originates from ancestral populations who survived in hierarchical societies with extreme power consolidation, particularly in early state-level civilizations between 8,000 and 2,000 years ago across Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, and the Indus Valley. These were environments where social stratification wasn't just cultural. It was enforced through systematic violence. Where rulers had absolute power over life and death. Where laws were arbitrary and enforcement was brutal. Here's the specific threat these populations faced. Authority figures were more dangerous than wild animals. Anthropologists discovered through analysis of legal codes, administrative records, and skeletal remains that in early state societies, the most common cause of premature death wasn't disease or starvation. It was execution. Public executions. Forced labor that resulted in death. Punishment for religious violations. Punishment for economic offenses. Punishment for social boundary crossing. The populations who survived developed a specific cognitive ability, the capacity to distinguish between authority figures who would enforce rules lethally and those who wouldn't. This required constant behavioral assessment. Reading the mood of rulers, officials, and enforcers. Knowing when to comply absolutely and when small transgressions would be overlooked. Evolutionary evidence shows that groups who survived weren't the ones who always obeyed. They were the ones who knew exactly when obedience was life or death, and when it wasn't. Modern research shows that descendants from regions with long histories of authoritarian rule display heightened sensitivity to power dynamics. They process hierarchical social cues faster. They adjust behavior based on who's watching. They have immediate, unconscious reactions to symbols of authority like uniforms, official settings, and documentation. Brain imaging shows increased amygdala activation when viewing images of authority figures, even in neutral contexts. Their nervous systems treat authority as inherently threatening until proven otherwise. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You feel anxiety around police even when you haven't done anything wrong. You become extremely careful and compliant in official settings like government offices, airports, or courtrooms. You have physical stress responses to receiving official letters or notices. You change your behavior completely when someone in authority is nearby. And people call you paranoid. They tell you there's nothing to be afraid of. They say just be yourself. But here's the warning. Your instinct isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. Because authority still has power. The consequences are still real. And the people who survived authoritarian systems were the ones who never forgot that power could be exercised without warning, without justification, without appeal. Modern people want to believe authority is reasonable. That if you follow the rules, you'll be fine. That the system is fair. Your ancestors knew better. They knew that authority was arbitrary. That rules changed. That punishment often had nothing to do with guilt. And the instinct that kept them alive was the instinct to treat every interaction with power as potentially lethal. To be careful. To be compliant. To never, ever assume that authority was on your side. Now let me show you the eighth instinct. This one is about something most people don't even realize they're doing. The eighth survival instinct is called environmental pattern recognition override, and it originates from ancestral populations who survived in regions where environmental conditions changed rapidly and unpredictably, particularly in monsoon zones, desert margins, and areas affected by El Niño oscillation patterns between 50,000 and 8,000 years ago. This includes populations across the Indian subcontinent, the Sahel region of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the southwestern coast of South America, and parts of Southeast Asia. Here's the specific threat these populations faced. The environment lied. In regions with extreme seasonal variability, the same landscape could be lush and abundant one year, then lethally arid the next. Rivers that flowed reliably for 3 generations would suddenly dry up. Rains that came like clockwork would fail without warning. Anthropologists discovered that populations in these regions couldn't rely on immediate sensory information to make survival decisions. What looked safe could become deadly within weeks. The survivors were the ones who developed the ability to detect subtle pattern disruptions that predicted larger environmental shifts. Changes in insect behavior. Variations in plant flowering timing. Shifts in animal migration patterns. Cloud formations that appeared months before monsoons failed. This created what researchers call anticipatory environmental modeling. The ability to construct mental models of how the environment should be behaving, and to detect deviations from that model before those deviations became obvious. Modern research shows that descendants from these regions display enhanced pattern recognition abilities across multiple domains. They notice small changes in routine, environment, or behavior that others miss. They detect anomalies faster. They're uncomfortable with unexplained variations even when those variations seem insignificant. Neurological studies show increased activity in the hippocampus and posterior parietal cortex during pattern matching tasks. These individuals aren't just observant. Their brains are actively building and testing environmental models constantly. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You notice when things are slightly different even when no one else does. You're bothered by small changes in routine or environment. You can tell when something is wrong before you can articulate what it is. You feel uneasy when patterns break even in minor ways. You remember sequences, schedules, and details that others forget. And people tell you you're overthinking. That you're being obsessive. That you notice things that don't matter. But here's the warning. Those things do matter. Your ancestors survived because they paid attention to deviations that everyone else ignored. Because the small pattern break today predicted the catastrophic environmental shift 6 months later. In modern contexts, this instinct shows up as catching problems before they become critical. Noticing relationship patterns before they collapse. Detecting health issues before symptoms become severe. Sensing economic shifts before markets crash. Other people call it overthinking. But when the pattern break actually does predict collapse, you're the one who saw it coming. Your instinct isn't trying to torture you with meaningless details. It's trying to keep you alive by detecting the signal in the noise. And now let me take you to the 9th instinct. The final one. The one that's hardest to accept because it reveals something about human survival that makes people deeply uncomfortable. The 9th survival instinct is called emotional detachment under existential threat, and it originates from every ancestral population that survived prolonged periods of mass death events. Plagues. Famines. Genocides. Warfare. Natural disasters. This instinct doesn't belong to one region or time period. It appears in populations across all 7 continents who experienced mortality events where 50% or more of the population died within a single generation. Anthropologists discovered something that challenges fundamental assumptions about human nature. When death becomes overwhelming, when loss becomes constant, when grief becomes unending, the humans who survive aren't the ones who feel the most. They're the ones who stop feeling entirely. Here's the specific threat these populations faced. Emotional attachment became a psychological liability. In contexts of mass death, every relationship was temporary. Every person you cared about would probably die before you did. Children, partners, parents, friends. The emotional investment in any individual became unbearable when loss was constant. Evolutionary evidence shows that populations who survived these events developed the capacity for what researchers call adaptive dissociation. The ability to continue functioning while temporarily disconnecting from emotional processing. This wasn't numbness. It was strategic detachment. The ability to care for people while simultaneously maintaining emotional distance from the inevitability of their death. Modern research into descendants of populations who survived genocide, plague, and mass starvation events shows something remarkable and disturbing. These individuals display muted emotional responses to loss compared to populations without that ancestral history. Brain imaging shows reduced amygdala activation during scenarios involving death or separation. Reduced connectivity between emotional processing regions and conscious awareness. They're not incapable of feeling. They're capable of not feeling when feeling would be incapacitating. If you have this instinct, here's how it shows up today. You go emotionally flat during crises when everyone else is breaking down. You can function in situations that overwhelm other people. You feel distant from people you care about even when there's no reason to. You struggle to feel grief even when you think you should. You can walk away from relationships without the emotional devastation others experience. And modern culture tells you you're cold. Detached. Damaged. Everyone says you need to open up, feel more, connect deeper. But here's the warning. Here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Your emotional detachment isn't a flaw. It's a survival mechanism that your ancestors developed because feeling everything would have destroyed them. Because when everyone around you is dying, the people who survive aren't the ones who grieve properly. They're the ones who can put grief aside and keep functioning. And here's the part that makes this instinct so difficult to live with. You can't control when it activates. It fires automatically in response to threat signals that your conscious mind doesn't even register. You don't choose to go cold. Your nervous system makes that choice for you. Because for your ancestors, emotional detachment was the difference between survival and psychological collapse. Modern people want to believe that feeling deeply is what makes us human. That emotional connection is always healthy. That detachment is always pathological. But your ancestors knew something different. They knew that sometimes, survival requires the ability to stop feeling. To keep moving. To keep functioning. To prioritize existence over emotional experience. And the uncomfortable truth is this: they were right. In contexts of genuine existential threat, the people who survive aren't the ones with the deepest emotional capacity. They're the ones who can turn it off. Your body still knows how to do that. And it will do it again if it needs to. Whether you want it to or not. So here's what we've covered. 9 survival instincts that are still controlling your behavior today. Hyper-Vigilance Encoding. Scarcity hoarding response. Nocturnal activation pattern. Threat anticipation sensitivity. Migration readiness encoding. Silence under threat protocol. Authority threat differentiation. Environmental pattern recognition override. Emotional detachment under existential threat. 9 patterns that were explained, revealed, and finally answered through evolutionary evidence collected across 7 continents, spanning 150,000 years. And here's what you need to understand. These instincts aren't memories. They're not psychological. They're genetic. They're written into your nervous system at a level that talk therapy can't reach and medication can't erase. Your ancestors didn't pass down stories about survival. They passed down the survival mechanisms themselves. And modern society doesn't know what to do with people who carry them. Because these instincts were designed for a world where danger was real, where threats were constant, where survival was uncertain. They make perfect sense in that world. But in a world that's safe, stable, and abundant, they look like dysfunction. Like anxiety disorders. Like paranoia. Like attachment issues. Like emotional problems. And so modern culture tries to fix them. Tries to calm them down. Tries to teach you to relax, to trust, to let go, to feel more, to stop overthinking. But what if the instincts aren't broken? What if the world is? What if we're living in a temporary period of safety that's only a few generations old, and your body remembers that safety never lasts? What if everything you've been told is wrong about you is actually the most right thing about you? What if the reason you can't turn these instincts off is because turning them off would make you vulnerable in exactly the ways your ancestors learned to avoid? I don't have an answer to that question. Nobody does.